Okay, folks, we're going to do a repair on this machine. First off, we're going to do the hardest thing first. We're going to pull the boiler. We have to pull the boiler because we think the heater is no good. And again, the heater is mounted on the bottom, and the only way to get to that is to take the boiler out. So before we say, oh my God, that's just going to be impossible to do, I can't do it, I got to send the machine in, let's take a look at it. So what we're going to do is we're going to, in our other video, I dropped and lifted the body because I need access to a couple of things to disconnect from the boiler before we can get the boiler out of the machine. So if we look at what's connected to the boiler, I need to remove a couple of these tubes. So first thing, any rubber tube we're going to take off. So we're going to take the rubber tube off the back of the pressure relief valve. Just let that hang there. So that can come off. We're going to disconnect the water sensor. So here's our water sensor. We're going to disconnect that. Here's a ground at the top of the boiler. We're going to disconnect that. Now, we need to disconnect the rubber hose, the braided hose from our solenoid valve. Now, on your solenoid valve, we have a factory clamp, which I've never loved these factory clamps. Factory clamps, in my opinion, are kind of garbage. I don't like them. So what we do when we replace them is we have an ear clamp. So these ear clamps slide over the hose and we just squeeze the top, and that's a much better clamp than these. So these clamps, if you need to take anything off these types of hoses, use a pair of side cutter pliers like this and just grab it, wiggle it off, and just this gets destroyed. It gets replaced with this. So this steam hose needs to pop off the nipple on our solenoid valve. Next, we need to disconnect this tube from the water pump because that leads into this fitting in the side of the boiler. So on these newer 100 machines, we disconnect it with a 14 millimeter open end wrench. We unscrew the nut. Now, as we unscrew the nut, the way these are now made is there's a ferrule bushing that goes into the fitting. So this ferrule right here makes the seal so we have no leaks. This probably is just not going to pull out because I've already disconnected it. It's not going to pull out simple like this. It's probably going to be a little tight. If it's tight and you get the nut moved out of the way, but this won't pull out, take the back of a screwdriver. Try not to use these because we're not going to grab it like this. We don't want to crush that hose. You want to bang it. If you bang it, it loosens it, comes out of the way. Now we have to get this tube off that leads to the Y fitting to the pressure gauge because that's at the top of the boiler. Now you can either bend the body back like this and remove it. You could do it with the body up. I've already loosened it. So this tube needs to come out. We have the same thing. There's a ferrule here that goes into that fitting that makes the seal. So now we're here. We can remove this wire, get everything out of the way. So now from up top, everything's disconnected. Our solenoid relay that goes to the solenoid that screws in the boiler, we need to get this back nut off. So we're going to take this back nut off. Take that nut off. This allows the solenoid relay to slide off our solenoid valve. Wires can stay connected. Just let that lay in the bottom. So now everything is disconnected from the top of the boiler, water lines to the boiler. Now what we have to do is just unbolt the boiler. The way we unbolt the boiler, turn the machine on its side, we have three 8 millimeter bolts in a triangular pattern. There's your drain plug, which you should be familiar with because you should be draining your boiler once a week. These 3 bolts are going to release the boiler from the mount on the bottom. Now, I know a lot of people have impact guns, and it's easy just to come in here and zip, 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 zip. We don't want to break the studs in the bottom of the boiler, so I don't want you using an impact gun. We're going to use just a ratchet wrench. 8 millimeter socket, doesn't need to be deep, it can be shallow. And we're just going to loosen. We're just going to take our 3 bolts out. That's going to release the boiler. Now, we see this is a little bit of a problem. Not really a problem. Oh, there we go. That also undid one of the sleeves that go on the bottom of the boiler. Still not a problem. We put these off to the side. And again, we don't want to lose anything. We want to make sure that we have the same amount of parts that are going back in that came out, the same amount of screws are going back in that came out. We don't want stuff rattling around on the bottom of the machine. So now the boiler is ready to lift out, but we can't get it totally out yet because we have wires. So the boiler is going to lift, and then what we can do is we can flop the boiler over. Now another thing I didn't go over, which I should have in the beginning of the video so we don't make a mess, what I just did was I took the boiler out and I turned it over. If there was water in the boiler, we'd have water coming out of this tube and we'd have water coming out of this tube, making a big mess on the inside of the machine. So don't do that. Drain your boiler when it's cold before you're ready to work on the machine if the boiler's coming out. So now we lift up the boiler, we move these wires out of the way, we move our steam tube out of the way. Now this looks like a bunch of spaghetti in here, but don't worry about it. We're going to take our boiler and we're going to turn it over. This exposes the heater. Now, good idea at this point is to take a picture because now everything turns upside down. So you look here, the blue wire is now at the left. When we put it back in, the blue wire ends up on the right. So what I like to do, you can take a Sharpie and you can mark in Sharpie blue, black, and our black is always staying on this side. Now our blue, again, because of the way the Europeans do everything, nothing's always white. So here's our white neutral, but our white neutral turns into blue and turns into tan in the back. Kind of not the way I prefer the Europeans do it, but that's the way they do it, and I can't get them to change it. If there's a zip tie that needs to be cut, we can cut the zip tie. They're not necessary, just don't cut the wire. So we cut the zip tie. We don't really need to cut the zip tie over here. So now take a picture. Now I know that, and you can tell by the curve of the wire. So we have these two wires that come into the back. This is our thermo switch, by the way. Our two wires come into the back of the thermo switch. This needs to be disconnected from the back. This needs to be disconnected from the front. This black wire does not need to be disconnected yet because it goes from the back of the thermo to the heater tab. The front black wire does need to be disconnected, and our blue wire to the heater needs to be disconnected. Now, the boiler is out. So in our next video, we're going to go over how to replace the heater. But we needed to get the boiler out of the machine to replace the heater, and that's the way to get the boiler out. I'm not going to do the video of putting everything back together because it really is just the opposite. So hopefully you can figure out how to get everything back together, lay the wires in the right place. We will talk about things you need to do and prep before you put the boiler back in, so we only do this once. And again, in my early days, I made mistakes and forgot to put stuff on the bottom of the boiler, and I ended up doing the job twice. We never want to do the job twice. So next, we're going to show you how to do a heater replacement and take care of that. And this is really the most difficult job to do on this machine. And I took my time, and however long this video runs, and as you're doing your heater replacement or your boiler replacement or whatever you're doing that needs the boiler to come out of the machine, all you have to do is just stop and pause the video and rewind it. That's the advantage of me doing these videos, is that if I'm speaking a little bit too fast or you're not understanding it, just rewind it, go over it. But there's no reason why you shouldn't be 100% doing this correctly the first time and not needing to send the machine back to me. So on to the next video.